Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Bai Xiaochun had nothing to say in response to Song Junwan. He knew that she was right. If the eternal immortal domains were destroyed, then considering how powerful the mortal renegade was, he would have no problem finding the treasured fan out in the void. And given that his Tao was to destroy everything and leave nothing behind, the people on the fan would surely not be allowed to escape. If the mortal renegade had not been sealed in place outside of the eternal immortal domains, then the damaged version of the fan would not have continued to exist. Even the hourglass world would have been destroyed. The only thing we can do, Zhou Zimo said, is spend time with each other before the final moment arrives. Bai Xiaochun, there's a place we'd like to take you to. Both Shi and Hu Xiaomei were smiling as they looked at Bai Xiaochun. Warmth bubbled up in his heart as he looked back at his Taoist partners. He would treasure these moments, as he knew that time was of the essence. At the most, he could spend a few days with the people he loved. After that, he would have to go into secluded meditation to work on his breakthrough. What place? He asked, smiling. Unbeknownst to him, Song Junwan, Zhou Zimo, Hu Xiaomei and Gong Sunwaner had prepared a place especially for the people from the Heavenspan realm. Unable to contain his curiosity, Bai Xiaochun sent his divine sense out, and found that there were others present. The Giant Ghost King, the Grand Heaven Master, Li Qinghao, Patriarch Spirit Stream, Big Fatty Zhang, Shu Baosai, Master God Diviner, and even Bruiser were there. The smiles on their faces only stoked Bai Xiaochun's curiosity. Together, they left Arch-Emperor City and traveled to a location on the border of the nation. Unable to contain his curiosity, Bai Xiaochun kept his divine sense sweeping out in front of him. Eventually, it locked onto something that caused him to shiver and his heart to pound. Eyes widening, he looked over at everyone who had come to accompany him. You guys. He almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was something that completely surpassed anything he could have imagined. There, off in the distance, was a prefecture that was roughly the size of the former Heavenspan realm. Before, it had been empty, but now, it contained 4 rivers. The rivers spread out from a central location, which was filled with seawater. Although it was little more than a lake, it was actually about the same size as the Heavenspan Sea of the past. Sects covered the banks of the rivers, and there was also a great wall, beyond which was the former Arch-Emperor City. Shockingly, he was looking at the Heavenspan realm. Clearly, much work and effort had gone into transforming this prefecture, and making every aspect of it the same as the Heavenspan realm. Bai Xiaochun was already feeling deeply shaken. Of course, his divine sense had long since reached the point of being able to fill the entire eternal immortal domains. But his attention had not been focused, and he had not noticed this prefecture. And there had been many momentous events since his return. Therefore, it was only at this moment that he realized what his people had been up to in recent times. When the Grand Heaven Master saw Bai Xiaochun's shock, he chuckled. Your Majesty, you were in secluded meditation for many years, and your empresses came to miss their home. So did I. Therefore, I took it upon myself to gather as many people of Heavenspan as possible. Together, we scoured our memories, and built this place based on them. I had hoped that it would be a beacon of hope for those of us from the Heavenspan realm. No longer would we feel like strangers in a strange land. Here, we could feel like we were home, and could reminiscence about past times. Sadly, after the construction was complete, a whole string of unexpected events occurred, and we never had time to report the matter to you, Your Majesty. Therefore, we never opened it up to the public. Clasping hands, the Grand Heaven Master bowed to Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun's emotions were astir as he thought back to past times. All of a sudden, it was like a door to the past had been opened right in front of him. Great. Excellent. Laughing heartily, he flew forward and entered the prefecture, followed by all of his people, whose eyes flickered with reminiscence and emotion. As Bai Xiaochun traveled through the new Heavenspan realm, his heart surged with excitement. Before long, he was in the eastern Heavenspan region, and the first place he visited was Mount Hood. It looked more or less how he remembered it. There was even a little village at the foot of the mountain, with a house just like his own. On the peak of Mount Hood, he closed his eyes and sank into his memories, flanked by all of his friends and family. Eventually, he opened his eyes, and the same smile appeared on his face that had often appeared there when he was younger. I'm not sure if all of you know, he began softly, but this was actually where I joined the Spirit Stream sect. My father gave me a stick of incense and told me that if I lit it, an immortal would come take me away. The only thing is that, whenever I lit the incense, lightning would fall, which scared me so much that I would instantly give up. It was only on the 13th time that I gritted my teeth, lit the incense, and braved the lightning. And that was when I met Uncle Li. With that, he looked over at Li Qinghao, much the same way he would have looked at his own father. Li Qinghao was old now, with white hair and wrinkles on his face. When he looked at Bai Xiaochun, he smiled, and yet, in his heart, he sighed emotionally. "That's right, you little punk," he said. "You lit that incense over and over again, and I was never able to get more than halfway there before you gave up. Eventually, I decided that when I found you, I would give you a good thrashing." Bai Xiaochun cleared his throat in embarrassment. "There's no need to bring up that part, Uncle Li." Song Junwan, Hu Xiaomei, and everyone else smiled when they heard the dialogue. After all, this mountain had been constructed based on Li Qinghao's personal memories. "From here, Uncle Li took me to the Spirit Stream sect." Turning his head, he looked off into the distance for a moment. Then, he used the extraordinary powers of his cultivation base to take a step forward and bring everyone with him to the Spirit Stream sect. It looked almost exactly as he remembered it. There was even a gravel path that he walked down, whereupon he found himself in the ovens. "This was where I met eldest brother. There were 8 fatties back then, but eldest brother was the one who jumped out first and scared the living daylights out of me. Back then, he was like a mountain of flesh." Big Fatty Zhang rubbed his nose awkwardly, but still chuckled a bit. "I remember thinking about how skinny you were," Big Fatty Zhang said, "and that I needed to fatten you up a bit. Who would have thought that your arrival would open up a new door to us ovens people? That was when we really learned how to pilfer delicacies." For many of the people present, it was their first time hearing of such things, especially Gongsun Wanner and Zhou Zimo. When Big Fatty Zhang saw how curious they were, he launched into a whole account of what he and Bai Xiaochun had done together in those years. At a certain point, he brought up the chicken-thieving fiend, which was when Hu Xiaomei let out a strangled shout. "I can't believe that you were the chicken-thieving fiend." Looking even more embarrassed, Bai Xiaochun pointed at one little hut off to the side. "See that? That's where Shu Baosai delivered his blood notice to me. He was really pissed about losing his place in the ovens, so he threw the blood notice down and challenged me to a fight." Shu Baosai chuckled, but didn't say anything. At this point, he realized that people weren't paying attention to him, and seemed more interested in Big Fatty Zhang's stories about the chicken-thieving fiend. At this point, Bai Xiaochun decided to take everyone to the trial platform staircase. At the top, he smiled. "This is the exact spot where I met Xiaomei." Hu Xiaomei looked at the steps, and a sweet smile broke out on her face. For her, it was almost like going back in time. That year, a young man and his 2 enormously fat friends blocked the path and extorted their fellow disciples. That year, a young woman stomped up, looking like a hot chili pepper. As soon as she saw the young man, her heart started to pound. Bai Xiaochun looked over at Hu Xiaomei, and she looked back at him. Both seemed to be transported back in time to that day. Eventually, Bai Xiaochun headed to the north bank of the Spirit Stream sect. At the Beast Conservatory, he saw the residence he and Bruiser had once occupied, and couldn't help but think back to the moment Bruiser had been born. "Bruiser," he said softly. Bruiser trotted over and shrank down to the size he had been back then, and his charming appearance caused warmth to fill Bai Xiaochun's heart. "This is where Bruiser was born," he explained. Bruiser's eyes also seemed to flicker with emotion as he thought back to old times. And thus, Bai Xiaochun visited all the familiar places he remembered in the Spirit Stream sect. As he recounted his past experiences and activities, everyone seemed to sink with him into their memories. Eventually, he left the Spirit Stream sect and went to the Bloodstream sect. On Middle Peak, he looked over at Song Junwan. She smiled back at him, looking more beautiful than ever. "You know, back when I came to the Bloodstream sect, I used a mask to disguise myself as Nightcrypt. My plan wasn't to snag a Taoist partner, I just needed to get into Junwan's bedchamber to steal some treasure." Chuckling, he rubbed his nose, and then pulled out the little turtle. Before the little turtle could complain, he held him out and said, "This thing. See? He was what I came to steal. Who would have thought that I would end up stealing the heart of my future Taoist partner too?" Bai Xiaochun suddenly felt quite pleased with himself. As for Song Junwan, the smile faded from her face, and her eyes widened into a glare. At that point, Bai Xiaochun chuckled and looked over at Master God Diviner. "This is where I met you too, Master Snort Snort. I'll never forget how shifty you looked back then. Who would have thought that you would end up as a genius of having children?" Of course, Bai Xiaochun had a much different status nowadays. His Taoist partners might dare to talk back to him, and maybe even Big Fatty Zhang, but not Master God Diviner. He could only smile wryly. Inside, he sighed, musing that life really was a strange thing. After all, if he hadn't met Bai Xiaochun all those years ago, he would not be in his current position. After touring the Heavenspan region, Bai Xiaochun went to the Great Wall and beyond it, to the Wildlands, which was even more well created than the Heavenspan region. With the exception of its lack of vengeful souls, it was exactly as he remembered it. The Wildlands was where he and Zhou Zimo had fought in the labyrinth, which had also been carefully recreated. Inside the labyrinth, Bai Xiaochun laughed. There was no need to even ask whether or not this place had been constructed based on Zhou Zimo's memories. After all, he and she were the only two that had reached the final level of the place. Smiling, he looked over at her and said, "Zimo, this is where you very nearly killed me. Do you realize how close to death I came?" Glaring back at him, she snorted. "It would have been a lot better if I did kill you." Bai Xiaochun smiled wryly and cleared his throat. Meanwhile, everyone else was laughing as though he had just cracked a joke. "I'm serious," he added. "I nearly died here. And all for a measly diva soul." Surprisingly, Zhou Zimo was blushing a bit. Back in those days, she had viewed diva souls as extremely precious, only to eventually reach a point where she could have as many as she wanted. And then she thought about how unlucky Bai Xiaochun had been to end up fighting her, and considered how things would have ended up if she did kill him. Suddenly, she started laughing. Bai Xiaochun left the labyrinth and headed to Giant Ghost City. There, the Giant Ghost King looked around wistfully, clearly reminiscing about past times. When he looked at the huge statue of himself, and at the royal palace, it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. He simply sighed. "Giant Ghost, old pal," Bai Xiaochun said loudly, "why didn't you reconstruct Devil Penitentiary? You call me father-in-law, you hear?" Laughing, Bai Xiaochun nodded vigorously. "Of course, father-in-law, that's better. Anyway, just forget about Devil Penitentiary. It's not here." The Giant Ghost King knew Bai Xiaochun very well, and had long since guessed that if the Heavenspan realm were rebuilt, he would want to come here and boast about his past shenanigans. Therefore, to play things safe, he had intentionally left out Devil Penitentiary. "I really miss Devil Penitentiary," Bai Xiaochun said. "Hey everyone, did you know that the Giant Ghost King was locked in there once? He was in very bad shape. Then I came along, a dark inquisitor. I happened to notice an old man in one of the cells, which was when I..." Ignoring the grim look on the Giant Ghost King's face, Bai Xiaochun went on to tell the story of how the two of them had met. Eyes widened as Bai Xiaochun spoke of smacking the Giant Ghost King on the side of the head, of using him as a shield to break out of Devil Penitentiary, and of dragging him around the city and using him as a weapon to kill numerous enemies. Many a sympathetic look was cast in the Giant Ghost King's direction. "You know what? All these Giant Ghost King stories have jogged my memory. I seem to remember that there was also a certain pretty widow." All of a sudden, the Giant Ghost King started to get nervous, but Bai Xiaochun simply cast him a mischievous glance, and didn't tell any more of that story. At this point, the Grand Heaven Master chuckled dryly, looked up at the sky to check the time of day, and then said, "Your Majesty, it's starting to get late. Why don't we head back now?" "What's the hurry, Grand Heaven Master? I still haven't gotten to your part of the story yet." The Grand Heaven Master was actually turning to leave, but there was no way Bai Xiaochun would let him. Grabbing him by the arm, he vanished, along with the rest of the group, to appear in the Heavenspan Realm's version of Arch-Emperor City. Specifically, they were in Heaven Master Hall in the Imperial Palace. "See everyone? This is where the enigmatic Grand Heaven Master of years past would order me around." Eyebrows dancing up and down, he looked at the Grand Heaven Master and then proceeded to tell all the pertinent stories. Eventually, the Grand Heaven Master's eyes widened into a glare. "You really have the cheek to pretend that you didn't come up with that vicious plan to pass off a Foundation establishment soul as a diva soul? And by the way, the proclamation of universal grace was your idea." Slowly but surely, everyone was coming to realize that wherever Bai Xiaochun went, he always caused a huge storm. And as far as his ability to cause disasters went, it was nothing short of legendary. All of a sudden, the Grand Heaven Master and everyone else present suddenly had the feeling that the impending catastrophe of the mortal renegade might not be a very big deal. With Bai Xiaochun on their side, the situation was sure to be resolved eventually. The sudden confidence improved their mood, and as Bai Xiaochun finished his tour of the new Heavenspan realm, everyone joined in on telling stories about past times. Eventually, it began to grow dark, and they returned to Arch-Emperor City. For the following few days, Bai Xiaochun refrained from any practice of cultivation. He spent all of his time with his family and friends, especially Song Junwan, Hu Xiaomei, Zhou Zimo and Gongsun Waner. And most especially, Dabao, Xiaoxiao and Zhaobao. He was a husband and a father now, and as such, wished that times like this would last for all eternity. But unfortunately, they had to come to an end. He needed to go into seclusion, and however much he would miss them, he had no choice but to enter his private meditation chamber. He had no idea if he would succeed or not, and no way to tell what the future would hold. He could only do everything in his power to achieve the breakthrough he sought. I have to break through and earn a chance at life. If I don't, then going into seclusion will be my final act of farewell. He stopped for a moment at the door of the chamber, looking over his shoulder at all his friends and family. And then, he slowly closed the door, cutting himself off completely from their sight. The door to his private chamber became like a door closing him off from the entire world. He sat down cross-legged, closed his eyes, and settled his emotions. It took some time, but he pushed aside all extraneous thoughts, and when he opened his eyes again, they shone with utter determination. He was now in a state that he rarely entered. His cultivation base had steadily climbed over the years, and considering all of the things he had experienced, and all the twists and turns that had come in his life, at some point, Bai Xiaochun realized that he had grown up. After visiting the reconstructed Heavenspan realm, and looking back on the path he had walked, his heart had steadily grown more and more calm. At the same time, he had begun to formulate the very thoughts that the Eternal Mother had alluded to. The mortal renegade's Tao is one of complete extermination of everything. It takes the starry sky and snuffs it out like a candle, casting everything into darkness, and turning all life into death. The reverse of his Tao would do the opposite. It would cause the extinguished starry sky to spark with new life. If the mortal renegade represents nirvanic extermination, then my Tao must be one of radiance and light. Bai Xiaochun's eyes glittered as he contemplated the subject. This was actually the entire goal of this session of secluded meditation. As for how to go about it, Bai Xiaochun already had an idea. In fact, it had something to do with a plant he had acquired long ago. Closing his eyes, he issued a soft call in his heart, a call that caused his private chamber to tremble. In fact, the entire imperial palace shook physically, and eventually, all of Archemperor City. The inhabitants looked around in bewilderment, although not for long. Moments later, a crevice opened up within the city, from which emerged a huge, vine-like plant. Moments later, a second vine appeared, then a third and a fourth. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of them had risen up, and were dancing in the breeze. What are those things? Heavens! I can't believe a plant like that exists beneath Archemperor City. That aura, it surpasses the demigod realm. It's more like the celestial realm. Amidst the uproar, the plants responded to Bai Xiaochun's call, and as they danced, they began to shine with moonlight that rose into the air and swirled above the city. As everyone watched in awe, the moonlight converged, creating a shining moon whose light shook the hearts of everyone present. It was almost as if an actual moon were now present, hanging directly above Archemperor City, shining brightly. Then, the moon began to fall. Before anyone could react, it shot toward Bai Xiaochun's private chamber. The Grand Heaven Master and other top experts initially attempted to interfere, but were then instructed by Bai Xiaochun's divine sense to back away. As they did, they watched the shining moon slowly disappear into Bai Xiaochun's meditation chamber. Inside the chamber, Bai Xiaochun reached out with his right hand to grasp the shining light, which flickered and jumped with pleasure, as if he were its lord and master. A smile broke out on Bai Xiaochun's face as he sent some divine sense out, causing the light in his hand to glitter, and then revealing a seed made of moonlight, the glow of which sent soft radiance into every corner of the private chamber. It was none other than his moonflower. He had planted the moonflower beneath the city years ago, when he initially went into seclusion, leaving it as a secret weapon to be used in the defense of the city. However, it had never been necessary to defend the city in such a way. Now, as he formulated his plan for how to achieve a breakthrough, he realized that the moonflower was actually key. More precisely, he remembered that, back in the original Heavenspan realm, the moonflower had eventually reached a point in its growth where it transformed into countless dandelion seeds, which spread out into all heaven and earth. He had witnessed that event with his own eyes. It had been a very profound moment, and was something he could never forget, not even after all the things he had experienced afterward. 1. If I want to walk the opposite path as the mortal renegade, he murmured, then I need to reignite all of the extinguished flames that filled the starry sky of the past. To do that, I need the strength of the moonflower. He had come up with this idea some time ago, and now that the time had come to put it into action, his eyes shone with determination. Other methods might work as well, but there isn't enough time. The fastest way will be to fuse with the moonflower, and borrow its ability to multiply and spread, thus sending seeds of my own divine sense out into the void. Certain that this was the best idea, he unhesitatingly covered the moonflower seed with divine sense. Having accomplished this, he closed his hand over the seed, which vanished. When it reappeared in his mind, it immediately began to sprout, sending tendrils throughout his body. Before long, he had fused with the moonflower, a process which did not harm either of them. In fact, if his plan succeeded, and he brought light to the dark void outside, then the moonflower would be his companion plant, and in some respects, would be another eternal flower. The moonflower understood that, and in its excitement, did nothing to oppose the process. As it fused with Bai Xiaochun, it slowly fell into a state of slumber, handing control of itself over to him. It was hard to say how much time passed. Bai Xiaochun was so involved with his work that he forgot everything else. Soon, he had become the moonflower itself, whereupon soft moonlight radiated off of him, which floated out of his meditation chamber and up into the sky. At first, there were only about 10 motes of light, which entered the void and began to drift away from the eternal immortal domains. However, those motes of light soon began to multiply. Eventually there were 100, then 1,000, then 10,000. Eventually the numbers climbed higher. 1 million, 10 million, 100 million. Soon, the number was too high to count, an endless stream of light which rose up from Bai Xiaochun and sailed out into the sky, and the void beyond. They looked like glowing dandelion seeds made of moonlight, and they were very eye-catching, drawing the attention of all the living beings in the eternal immortal domains. Although no one knew exactly what they were, or what their purpose was, they could sense the powerful flame of life force they contained. After all, they weren't just a manifestation of Bai Xiaochun's divine sense. They also contained his life force, his Tao, and everything else that made him up. Within the meditation chamber, his body slowly withered, growing older and older until all that was left behind was an empty husk. His soul, his Tao, his cultivation base, and all other aspects of him had entered the dandelion seeds, and were spreading out through the void. They did not move about aimlessly. They all had specific destinations, those being the destroyed ruins that filled the void, the places where light had once burned, but was later extinguished. Every time such a location was found, a dandelion seed would settle down and sprout. Days began to slip by. Although everyone in the eternal immortal domains was still nervous about the impending catastrophe, they knew that both the Saint Emperor and Bai Xiaochun were both working hard to provide hope. And the only thing that everyone else could do was wait and work on their cultivation. Although advancing their cultivation bases would do little good in the end, no one was willing to abandon any possible advantage. And of course, it served to calm their hearts. There were still people who abandoned themselves to despair. But the celestials of the two great imperial dynasties did their best to quell such trends, and dispose of any individuals who had lost their humanity. And thus, life went on in the eternal immortal domains, and affairs mostly stabilized. Eventually, 10 years had gone by. Zhao Bao was now 10 years old, and his personality was very much like his father's. Whenever Hu Xiaomei and the rest of his family saw him acting mischievous and fearing death, they couldn't help but look over wistfully at Bai Xiaochun's meditation chamber. Inside the chamber, Bai Xiaochun sat there cross-legged, unmoving for an entire decade. Over the 10-year period, countless dandelion seeds spread out into the void, all of which contained Bai Xiaochun's life force and divine sense. They moved with speed that defied the comprehension of cultivators, piercing through the void even faster than Bai Xiaochun could have moved on his own. Some landed on various ruins, while others continued on, reaching places far, far away from the eternal immortal domains. And as the dandelion seeds landed and took root, changes began to take place. In one particular location was a stretch of ruins completely devoid of any signs of life. It was desolate, withered, and rife with death. There was even a misty haze that hung over the area, almost like a sludge. A dandelion seed dropped into the haze, and vanished. A few years later, the mist began to fade away, along with the feeling of death. Another 3 years passed, and the mist and aura of death were gone, which was when a delicate sprout rose up from the mud below. Although it was only a tiny sprout, it still represented life. It seemed to have broken through some sort of seal, a curse of sorts, which allowed it to spread life force, completely changing the ruins around it. Another 3 years passed, and the sprout bloomed, giving birth to a flower that looked exactly like a moon. It was none other than a moonflower. When the moonflower bloomed, it emitted a faint, glittering light. It wasn't particularly dazzling, but in the darkness of the void, it was still breathtaking. The light grew stronger, slowly driving away the darkness, growing more stable. Gradually, that portion of the dark void was becoming bright. And that was only one set of ruins among many. Before long, a second light blazed to life, and then another, and another. One by one, sparks were appearing. Although they were single sparks now, that didn't mean they couldn't combine into a raging fire. As the dandelion seeds found more and more ruins, and as the years passed, more light appeared. By now, Bai Xiaochun had been in secluded meditation for more than 20 years. Zhao Bao was a young man now, whose main impression of his father was that he remained sealed behind a door. However, based on the things that his older brother and sister had told him, he knew that his father was a grand and mighty individual. Dabao had taken over the responsibilities of running the Arch-Emperor dynasty as the heir apparent, and with the help of the Grand Heaven Master and other powerful experts, assimilated the former vile Emperor dynasty. Xiao Xiao had risen to the level of a celestial, but had not gained the approval of the Eternal Mother. However, she had Bai Xiaochun's approval, and as he transformed into a host of dandelion seeds that spread through the void, the karma between them caused her cultivation base to advance by leaps and bounds. In the short 20 years that passed, she reached the mid-celestial realm. It was at that time that strange signs occurred. The mortal renegade hadn't moved for 20 years, but now, he suddenly trembled. Instantly, the people of the eternal immortal domains descended into vigilant anxiety. Both Bai Xiaochun and the Saint Emperor were still in seclusion, leaving the eternal immortal domains without a single archean. Thankfully, no meteorites fell. Unfortunately, a vortex sprang up on the mortal renegade's forehead. As it did, Taoist Heavenspan appeared. He had been scared off years ago by Bai Xiaochun, but now he was back, an unsightly expression on his face as he looked first at the spell formation which bound the mortal renegade, and then down at the eternal immortal domains. If he could have his way, he would not see the eternal immortal domains destroyed. However, the sleeping mortal renegade had sensed some dangerous crisis brewing, and had given him a very specific mission. Break through the spell formation. End Bai Xiaochun's session of meditation. Taoist Heavenspan had mixed feelings regarding Bai Xiaochun, feelings that he had not been able to sort out even after all the years that had passed. Taoist Heavenspan knew that he had no choice in the matter. Although he was an apprentice, the truth was that most of his actions were controlled by his own Tao. And the origin of that Tao, that of nirvanic extermination, was the mortal renegade. Sometimes Taoist Heavenspan asked himself if it was all worth it. And he wondered if he could go back to the very beginning, if he might have made different choices. But there was no real way to answer that question. He could only suppress his melancholy, and look out with sharply cold eyes. As of this moment, he waved his arm, causing the vortex in the mortal renegade's forehead to swirl. Then, howls and roars could be heard as a vast horde of devilish specters emerged. There were too many of them to count, a massive army that was now at the command of Taoist Heavenspan. Without any hesitation, the army charged toward the spell formation that Bai Xiaochun had set up using the essence of time. Rumbling sounds echoed out into the void, and quickly caught the attention of the cultivators down below in the eternal immortal domains. Shocked, they began to rotate their cultivation bases to fight back. This was one of the marvelous aspects of the spell formation. Every single formation node in the entire spell formation was linked to a cultivator, which made it nearly invincible. However, if enough of the nodes were broken, then it would eventually fall. All that would be required was enough time. The assault on the spell formation lasted for 3 years. During that time, rumbling sounds filled the sky above the eternal immortal domains both day and night. Taoist Heavenspan wasn't concerned at all with how much time it was taking. There were too many devilish specters inside of the mortal renegade to even count, and even if they were all killed, Taoist Heavenspan wouldn't care. Despite the heavy losses that the army of devilish specters sustained during the 3 years, Taoist Heavenspan did not call off the offensive. Furthermore, the constant assault was pushing the spell formation to the brink of detonation. Black marks could be seen spreading across its surface, staining the essence of time, and causing the spell formation to slowly grow weaker. It won't be long now. Taoist Heavenspan murmured. Waving his hand, he sent even more devilish specters charging forth in attack. It was a difficult time for the cultivators in the eternal immortal domains. Virtually none of them were able to focus on cultivation. They were forced to sit there cross-legged and focus their energy on the spell formation, powering it with their cultivation bases to resist the advance of the devilish specters. Although the two parties were separated by the formation, they were involved in a very strange and unique showdown. Meanwhile, the dandelion seeds that contained Bai Xiaochun's life force and divine sense had thoroughly disseminated throughout the void. They descended onto the ruins everywhere, even into that floating field of coffins that he had once encountered. With each year that passed, more light flared to life. As of now, if one looked out into the void, there was dazzling starlight everywhere. As of now, it could truly be called a starry sky again. The changes caused the sleeping mortal renegade to grow even more restless, and Taoist Heavenspan was likewise gripped by anxiety. He could sense the fury of the mortal renegade, and when he looked out at the rapidly deteriorating spell formation, it was with completely bloodshot eyes. It's about time to end things. Bai Xiaochun is in seclusion, and thanks to the help of the mortal renegade, I'm now a half-sovereign. As of this moment, nobody can stop me. In this moment, Taoist Heavenspan closely resembled the mortal renegade. In fact, a vortex appeared on his own forehead, within which a face could be seen, which was none other than the face of the mortal renegade. His aura was different as well, there was an air to it that suggested nirvanic extermination, as though he wished any area he saw to be filled with death. The ultimate expression of my Tao is to bring nirvanic extermination to everything. In the end, only I shall be eternal. He strode forward, flanked by hordes of burning devilish specters. Then he extended his hand, causing numerous specters to clump together in front of him, forming a huge blazing fire of darkness. It was none other than a black flower of flame. Nirvanic extermination, he said calmly. The black flame flower began to grow larger, spinning, rumbling, becoming a sea of flames that shot directly toward the crumbling spell formation. The sky turned black as the flames spread out, and the spell formation that had stood for many years finally began to collapse. When that happened, all of the cultivators connected to the formation nodes, regardless of the level of their cultivation base, began to cough up mouthfuls of blood. Trembling, and faces ashen, they looked up, despair flickering in their eyes. As they did, countless chunks of the spell formation began to fall down toward the ground. Without anything to stand in its way, the black sea of flames rushed out, followed by a huge army of devilish specters. Howling, they shot toward the eternal immortal domains, followed by Taoist Heavenspan, whose shocking aura seemed like that of a sovereign. He was wreathed in black flames, almost like a cloak of darkness, and as his hair floated around him, he emanated the icy coldness of nirvanic extermination. Further back, the mortal renegade remained in place, the same as ever, and yet, seemed to be struggling to open his eyes. To the further despair of the cultivators below, the ceiling strip that Bai Xiaochun had repaired was now beginning to collapse, starting from the portion near the Dantian region, and moving slowly upward toward his forehead. Once that strip vanished completely, the mortal renegade would wake up. The true moment of deadly crisis for the eternal immortal domains was nigh. From a distance, a sea of flames and an army of countless devilish specters descended on the eternal immortal domains, led by Taoist Heavenspan. And their target was Arch-Emperor City. That was their ultimate goal, because that was the location of Bai Xiaochun, Song Junwan, Hu Xiaomei, Zhou Zimo, Gongsun Wan'er, the Grand Heaven Master, Li Qinghao, the Giant Ghost King. There were many powerful experts in Arch-Emperor City, and all of them were gathered around Bai Xiaochun's meditation chamber, staring with ashen faces and despairing eyes at the fire and the specters, and most especially, at Taoist Heavenspan. Many a bitter sigh could be heard. In the end, there just wasn't enough time. Perhaps when he went into meditation, it really was the final farewell. As Xiao Xiao stood there, she looked over her shoulder at Bai Xiaochun's private chamber, and whispered, "Dad." Her voice was filled with sorrow and love, and at the same time, a tone of farewell. The Grand Heaven Master chuckled bitterly, and the Giant Ghost King sighed. The other Celestials all exchanged glances with bloodshot eyes. They knew that there was nowhere to run, and therefore, they began to power up their cultivation bases and prepare for a fight to the death. However, that was when the eternal immortal domains began to tremble violently, as an explosive aura suddenly appeared. Much to the shock of everyone, it surpassed the Archean realm, and caused Taoist Heavenspan to look with flickering eyes in the direction of the Eternal Sea. Although it seemed to fill all of the eternal immortal domains, Taoist Heavenspan knew exactly where it was coming from. In a deep crevice in the Eternal Sea was the entrance to the Eternal River. And in the depths of the Eternal River, sitting in front of the bell that represented the Eternal Mother, was the Saint Emperor, who had just opened his eyes. As he did, a sigil appeared on his forehead, depicting the Eternal Flower. Taoist Heavenspan had a similar mark on his own forehead, a sigil which represented a sovereign. Both of these individuals were half-sovereigns, and therefore, those marks indicated that their true power came from other sources. Unfortunately, the Saint Emperor had not finished the process of elevating his cultivation base and becoming a half-sovereign. He was not yet stable, and yet, had no choice but to end his session of cultivation. He was the Saint Emperor. This was his home, and his Tao came from the Eternal Mother. Rising to his feet, he spoke in a voice that surpassed heavenly thunder, filling all of the eternal immortal domains with a roar of rage. The Arch-Emperor is not here, Taoist Heavenspan. Therefore, I, the Saint Emperor, will defend these lands. Stepping forward, he vanished, to reappear in the air above Arch-Emperor City. As he did, a tempest rose up in the eternal immortal domains, a windstorm that converged on Arch-Emperor City and immediately began to resist the Black Sea of Flames. Massive rumbling sounds echoed out as the two forces met, nearly deafening the living beings in the eternal immortal domains. As the Saint Emperor strode forth, he reached out toward Saint Emperor City and made a grasping gesture, causing the enormous lotus within the heavenly pond to shudder for a moment, then vanish. When it reappeared, it was beneath the Saint Emperor, shining with soft light. As that glow spread out, it covered Arch-Emperor City, making it impossible for the Black Sea of Flames or the devilish specters to enter the city. Having resolved that small crisis, the Saint Emperor looked up, the sigil on his forehead shining as he shot toward Taoist Heavenspan. "How amusing," Taoist Heavenspan said, chuckling as he looked with cold eyes at the Saint Emperor. "Unfortunately, your Tao comes from the paltry eternal flower. My Tao comes from the mortal renegade, a powerful sovereign. That puts me on another level altogether. Furthermore, you haven't stabilized yourself as a half-sovereign. You simply don't qualify to stand in my way." Laughing madly, Taoist Heavenspan vanished, then reappeared directly in front of the Saint Emperor in a black blur of light. The Saint Emperor's face fell as that black light slammed into him, causing blood to spray out of his mouth as he tumbled backward. The black light didn't seem fazed at all by the interchange, and immediately shot toward him again. The light destroyed the air around it, and dissipated any nearby life force, replacing it with a powerful aura of death. As it closed in, the Saint Emperor roared and performed a double-handed incantation gesture, instantly causing a huge moon to appear around him. This was one of his most powerful divine abilities, and now that his cultivation base was higher, it was no longer a crescent moon, but rather, a full moon. And yet, despite the powerful pressure it radiated, Taoist Heavenspan simply chuckled, reached out, and pushed against the moon. Instantly, cracks spread out across it, and the moon shattered into countless pieces. More blood sprayed out of the Saint Emperor's mouth, and he fell back again, a defiant gleam in his eyes. If only I could have had a few more years. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.